The Straus Center, thanks to an idea that Moshel had, with a little help from me, but actually only a little, has developed into an extraordinary idea and an extraordinary operation because of its vision and because of its director, Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveitchik Chacham. The Straus Center has an array of wonderful activities and important programs, and we invite your continued participation and partnership. So this evening marks the first of a series of programs that we will do through the help of the Menachem Begin Heritage Foundation, through the munificence of Mr. Haston, to recall and explore and celebrate Menachem Begin as an important hero of the Jewish people. But as long as I'm talking about heroes, let me talk just for a moment about Hart Haston. He enjoyed a 25-year intimate relationship with his mentor, Menachem Begin. Among Hart's major accomplishments, he's a founder of the Haston Hebrew Academy in Indianapolis. Yes? Okay, good. The former president of Cherut Zionists of America and confidant of the late Prime Minister Ariel Sharon.
Because Menachem Begin was my hero, even before he became Prime Minister and after he became Prime Minister. He was my hero, my mentor, my commander, my guru. Okay, so I am now directly going to introduce the two gentlemen, and Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, the director of the Zahava and Moshel Straus Center of the Torah Western Thought at Yeshiva University, and rabbi of the congregation Sharit Israel in Manhattan, and perhaps most importantly for tonight's program, both his family and Menachem Begin's, they both come from Brest-Litovsk in Yiddish, from Brisk. Dr. Daniel Gordis, Senior Vice President of the Koret Distinguished Fellow, Shalem College in Jerusalem. He's a regular columnist for the Jerusalem Post and a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the author of numerous books on Jewish thought and currents in Israel, and a recent winner of the National Jewish Book Award. Dr. Gordis was the founding dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at the University of Judaism, the first rabbinical college on the West Coast of the United States. His new biography of Menachem Begin, entitled Menachem Begin, The Battle for Israel's Soul, was recently just came out, published by Next Book. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers. As we say in Indianapolis, Indiana, at the start of the Indy 500, gentlemen, start your engines.
I'd like our conversation, Dr. Gordis, to proceed chronologically through Begin's life. So let's start with Begin's childhood. His childhood home in Brest-Litovsk, known, as Hart mentioned, by religious Jews everywhere as Brisk. Now, on the one hand, there was, as you note in the book, tension between Begin's very Zionistic parents and the anti-Zionist spiritual leaders of Brisk, a well-known rabbinic family by the name of, I have it here somewhere, Soloveitchik. Oh, this is awkward. At the same time, this is like an historic rapprochement, perhaps.
There you go.
Yeah. At the same time, Begin was formed and raised there, attended its cheder, davened in its shul, and spoke about his home and its distinguished rabbis constantly with pride. This was definitely not the Vienna of Herzl, nor was it the Odessa, the Haskalah Center in which Jabotinsky was raised. So how did the annihilation of the Jews of Brisk and the Shoah itself impact Begin as a Jew and as a family member? And in what way did this make him different, do you think, from the other Israeli founders?
Well, in a lot of ways, the Shoah shapes everything that he's about. Begin's greatness was that he was principled and not ideological. The principle was saving the lives of Jews. So in 1942, 43, 44, if to save the lives of Jews, you had to attack the British, that's what you did. But in 1978, 77, 78, and 79, if you could save the lives of Jews by making a deal with the most powerful Arab army and country in the world, you did that. In June 1981, if the way to save the lives of Jews was to attack Osirak, you did that. If the way to save the lives of Jews was to go to Stockholm and get the Nobel Peace Prize, you did that. It's not ideologically left, it's not ideologically right, it's principled. That the principle is saving the lives of Jews, and that's a tzava'ah that comes directly from the Shoah for him, I think.
So you mentioned already about Begin's arrival in Palestine. He was in the Soviet Gulag, really. Joins the Polish Free Army, is released to join the army, comes to Palestine, and assumes leadership of Etzel, the Irgun Tzvai the Irgun. Now, reading The Revolt in high school really impacted me probably more, that's Begin's memoir, more than any other book. And in his own memoir, Begin devotes several chapters to explaining the morality and the strategy behind what he called Hamered. In 1948, and throughout his life, he would refer to this revolt as the first Hebrew revolt since the Hasmonean insurrection that ended in victory. What I found so intriguing about your writing about Begin is that you compare Begin's revolt to another revolution by a ragtag band of rebels against the British Empire, and that's the American Revolution. So if you could explain maybe why this is a fitting comparison, how it struck you, and how you would use it to make the case for Begin's revolt.
The reason I wanted to spend some time, mostly towards the end of the book, so I'm very impressed you got all the way through. The reason I wanted to spend some time comparing the Zionist revolution to the American Revolution is because, especially when one talks about Begin, you have a sense, you're on the defensive immediately. In other words, this notion that if you weren't with Begin, you were completely and unalterably opposed to him. And there's this notion that because nasty things happened during the Zionist revolution, British sergeants were hung in a decision that Begin called the most difficult decision of his life, and he called it a Maaseh Achzari, a brutal act, which was, in fact, the title that I gave to that chapter in the book, because I wanted to give credit to the fact that Begin, 50 years later, on one hand said it was a brutal act, on the other hand he pointed out that after he did that, the British never hanged anybody else in Eretz Israel, and never hanged another Jew in Eretz Israel. But everybody assumes that the American Revolution was completely legitimate. And it's not as if all we did was dump tea in the harbor. The British did not leave because the harbor was polluted with tea bags. But nobody questions the legitimacy of the American Revolution because a lot of British soldiers died. And I was just trying to simply say that in this day and age when Begin is seen as being such a villain by some people, why is he more of a villain than George Washington? Why is he more of a villain than Nathan Hale? Why is he more of a villain than any of the other architects of the American Revolution, which everybody thinks of as a perfectly legitimate revolution? I think he wasn't any more of a villain, and the only way to make that point was to close the book with a kind of a comparison of the two. There's no question that David Ben-Gurion, without him we wouldn't have a Jewish state. But it's also, and he was really one of the great Jewish leaders of many, many centuries, there's no question. But it's also, I think, without any question, the case that when it came to Menachem Begin, David Ben-Gurion was literally crazy. He hated him with a kind of a visceral hatred because Begin stood for exactly the opposite of everything that Ben-Gurion stood for, and he wasn't afraid of Ben-Gurion. Everybody else was afraid of Ben-Gurion, and Begin wasn't afraid of very many people on the face of the planet. So there was something deeply personal, and I have to say here, by the way, that here Begin was, to his great credit, the ultimate Polish gentleman. So Ben-Gurion would refer to him as the person sitting next to M.K. Badr, and Begin would refer to him as Adon Rosh HaMemshala, Mr. Prime Minister, or Mr. Ben-Gurion. He took the high road in this one. The nice thing about the story, by the way, is that there were two stages of rapprochement. One of them is right before the '67 war. There's a national unity government. Begin is the head of the opposition. So now that there's a national unity government, because it's clear that war is going to break out, it was a very dark time. And Begin is brought into the government for the first time ever because there's a national unity government. The prime minister is Levi Eshkol. Whatever you want to say about Levi Eshkol, and that's a different conversation for a different night, a source of profound inspiration, he wasn't. And people were nervous. And Ben-Gurion and Begin says in the cabinet meeting, what we need is actually Ben-Gurion. Somebody should go to Sde Boker and tell David Ben-Gurion to come out of retirement and to run the government. And at the end of the day, Ben-Gurion didn't do it, but he was told that it had been Menachem Begin's idea. And it actually had an enormous impact on him. He actually said later on in his life that that was the minute that he began to actually rethink things.
But what I found fascinating about it, and you touch on this in your book, is that the argument he put forward for a public Judaism is not halachic. It's more about familial loyalty. It's simultaneously at times very frum, but it's not exactly something that an Orthodox Jew would instinctively say. Similarly, later as prime minister, Begin famously grounded all the El Al planes on Shabbat. The Aguda came and demanded it, and they were shocked when Begin agreed to it without actually asking for anything in return, because it was just a matter of principle. And he said, this is quoted, one need not be a religious person to appreciate Shabbat. You just need to be a proud Jew.
But yeah, it wasn't about halacha for him. I mean, he actually danced around the question of halacha. But there are people actually in Israel who are, I think, still thinking smartly about how do you make the public space Jewish, but it's Begin who introduced the concept into the Israeli narrative.
Let's skip ahead to 1977, to Begin's election as prime minister. Paul Johnson, the great British historian, wrote that, quote, before he finally became prime minister, Begin had lost, I calculate, more general elections than any other party leader in the history of democracy. I think that's true.
It is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This election is thus called the Mahapach, and really the creation then in Israel of an actual two-party system. There wasn't that before. What were the political and social factors that made this possible? What changes had taken place in Israeli society, and what failures had occurred by those who had ruled Israel since the founding?
June 67 leaves Israel in a high. June 67 leaves Israelis feeling invincible. And there is now what we call, looking back, the conceptia, which is a nice Hebrew word, which means conception. And the conceptia dies in October 1973 because Israel is just completely grounded in a sense that the Arabs are not going to try to do anything. And if you, just to keep the following statistics in mind, in 1967, Israel triples its size and 600 boys die. In 1973, Israel claws its way back to the lines from which it started and loses 3,000 men. It's a disaster. And of course, Golda Meir was held indirectly responsible. So labor has taken a huge blow in popular esteem because of that. Then there's a couple of different elections. We'll skip some of the details. But then Yitzhak Rabin is prime minister. His wife Leah has an account. You're not allowed to have foreign accounts back then in Israel. Today, by Israeli law, you're not allowed not to have a foreign account. But Leah Rabin has a foreign account. I think she's got $10,000. I mean, some, even back then, relatively insignificant sum. And when that's revealed, that's the last straw. Because labor had been seen as haughty, as elitist, as Ashkenazi, as self-serving, and so on and so forth. And so a large part of the Mahapach, which you spoke about in 1977, labor brings on itself. But there's a meanwhile back at the ranch. Meanwhile back at the ranch is that Menachem Begin had always been very popular with the Sephardim. Because, first of all, even though he was Polish and they were North African, he seemed to them to be a Jew. They were not necessarily rigorously halachic either. But Shabbos was Shabbos, and Pesach was Pesach, and Purim was Purim, and they knew what you were supposed to do. And Begin did all those things. And when they looked at Ben Gurion, they saw somebody that they really couldn't figure out. And when they looked at Begin, they said, this is what a Jew looks like. Was the Lebanon War a success? No. Did you need to do something to stop Yasser Arafat from taking hold of southern Lebanon? Yes. Was it okay to have survived the Shoah and then to destroy Osirak, but then to have Israeli children sleeping in bomb shelters in Kiryat Shmona night after night, week after week, month after month? No, it wasn't okay. And therefore Begin said, not on my watch. The United States found it very difficult to do this in Iraq and pulled out. The United States found it very difficult to do this in Afghanistan and pulled out. Israel does not have the luxury of pulling out of all of the regions of conflict because we live in them. And I think Israel discovered first, especially under Begin's command, that fighting these insurgencies that embed themselves in civilian populations is a very, very hard thing to do. And we are, again, the proverbial bellwether, the proverbial almost canary in the coal mine, reminding the world of what's just around the bend. I think we're actually kind of ben ha'arbaim here. I think we're actually sort of not yet far enough out of that and not yet far enough into the new thing to know what a new kind of Zionist passion, aware of and deeply honoring of the Shoah, is going to look like, but formed by something very, very different. I think it's just both a little bit too long and not long enough since. But we have to figure out a way to do it. There's got to be a way for Israelis to produce a generation of kids to whom the greatness of the Jewish tradition, its spiritual greatness, its intellectual depth, its moral compass, speaks to them in a way that says this is worth defending at all costs.
I
He's
heard so,
buried,
but-
and this is perhaps, I guess, the best way to put it. He's buried with Feinstein and Barazani. Feinstein and Barazani, one is Irgun and one is Lehi.
Sephardi and
One is
Ashkenazi.
Sephardi and one is Ashkenazi, and they were sentenced to be hanged by the British, and somebody had smuggled in a grenade that they were then going to pull and kill the British hangman along with them. Comes the rabbi the night before and says to them, don't worry, I will stay with you to the very end. You will not die alone. And then they realize that they can't do that because they're going to kill the rabbi. So in their cell the night before, they sing Adon Olam, they pull the pin, they hug the grenade between their two chests, and they kill themselves that way. And Begin's very, very simple little will, which is like 4 hand-scribbled lines,
To Yechiel.
to Yechiel, says, bury me next to Feinstein and Barazani. And if you go up to Har HaZeitim right now, there's Feinstein and there's Barazani. One says Irgun and one says Lehi. One's clearly Sephardi, one's clearly Ashkenazi. And right behind them are Eliza and Menachem Begin. And I think his magnetism is simply that he was selfless, courageous, wholeheartedly devoted to the safety and the flourishing of the Jewish people. And I think people have a reverence for him, not only for what he was, but for what they hope and pray Am Yisrael will one day produce once again.
Please join me in thanking our guest.